Morning, everybody. Great crowd. Thank you for coming out. We're going to start the festivities here this morning. Before I get into festivities, I do want to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. The flag is right out on the golf course, so we'll face that way. And I'll let our guest, Abraham Lincoln, lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. As I've mentioned a couple of the quick things again, we do have a great silent auction going on right out at the bar. All proceeds that we raise from the silent auction will go back to the town committee to donate to our candidates here in the 2020 election cycle. Also, the New England for Trump store is set up right out past the bar. Give him your support. He's got some great Trump merchandise and memorabilia, so we certainly are excited to have New England for Trump here. They've got some great locations in the area as well. I'd like to introduce some of our elected officials and guests that are here with us today. First off, a gentleman who will be speaking here shortly on the history of Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, and some ties that he has here to the South Shore and Massachusetts. Sheriff Joe McDonald is here. Plymouth County Commission Chair Dan Pallotta. State Representative Allison Sullivan, and Allison is collecting signatures. I don't know if she has her nomination papers with her, but we are at that time of the year. Constable from the town of East Bridgewater, Bob Van Duzen, is here. East Bridgewater Finance Committee member Dave Walsh. Board of Health agent Bob Philbrick. And Whitman Selectman Brian Bezanson. We also have state committee candidates Jeff Deal and Kathy Jo Boss. And again, thank you everybody for coming. State rep candidate Summer Schmalling is here. She's from Halifax. And I don't believe I missed anybody. If I did, let me know, and we'll definitely give them a plug later on here in the event. Without any further...
Whitman School Board.
Yes, Whitman Hanson School Committee member Dan Cullity. And we have many former East Bridgewater selectmen in attendance as well. So thank you all for coming this morning. This is a great turnout. Without any further ado, I will introduce to you the gentleman of the day, President Abraham Lincoln, also our former veterans agent from the town of East Bridgewater, Bob Charles.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
First of all, before we start, I was a previous veteran agent in East Bridgewater. I am happy to be here today, and it is an honor to be here, and I thank Miles Hager for the invite. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a few seconds of remembrance or keeping your thoughts and prayers, all the men and women that are serving this great country. You know, for a moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. we have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave them the full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall never perish from the earth. I thank you very much. And again, thanks for the invite, and it's my honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Lincoln. Anybody who would like to get pictures with the President after the speaking portion is done, we would be glad to make sure that happens. Also, I would be remiss if I did not mention our terrific staff here today at Adria's. Owner Bladar, and of course you may have recognized a familiar face. Former Red Sox pitcher Manny Del Carmen is right here today. He's got a couple of his World Series rings, and he'd be glad to take pictures with you guys afterwards as well. So we appreciate the staff here. We wouldn't be able to do it without them today. And more food is coming out if it hasn't already, so please continue to help yourself as we continue on through the program. Next, a gentleman who has worn many different hats here, not only in Plymouth County, but also a current state committee man, and obviously a lot of folks may be interested and involved in what the state committee role is. The election's coming up on March 3rd. Sheriff Joe McDonald has represented Plymouth County as the sheriff here for the last 15 years. And he's continued not only to give back to our county, but also to the Republican town committees and the Republican Party here as well. The sheriff has decided to is stepping in for Tim Cruz today to speak on the historical significance of Abraham Lincoln here in Plymouth County and here in East Bridgewater, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So without any further ado, Sheriff Joe McDonald.
Thank you, Miles, and good morning, one and all. Good morning, Mr. President. A special good morning to you. Thank you for gracing us with those words. I would be remiss. I thank you, Bob, also for the moment of silence that we had this morning. As Miles mentioned, I am the second team today. I'm filling in for my friend and colleague, Tim Cruz. Tim could not be here today, although he really did want to be, and I want to explain why. Tim had to go to Fort Drum. Tim's son, as many people may or may not know, is a captain in the United States Army Rangers, 10th Mountain Division, and his son is about to deploy to Afghanistan. So Tim has gone to be part of that ceremony, and we wish him well and we wish him safe. And one thing that I will ask on behalf of the Cruz family is that you remember young Tim Cruz in your prayers, so that he makes it home safe. So this is a sad day, but a big day for the Cruz family. But I'm more than happy to fill in. I appreciate Timmy having trusted me to cover this for him, and I appreciate Miles. giving me the time. One of the things that people may or may not know about me is Miles says I've worn many hats. And one of the hats that I have worn and enjoyed wearing on many different occasions, I hope someday I'll return to that, is I taught history at the college level. History has always been something that has really intrigued me, interested me, and in some instances made me upset because, you know, I see as we watch the national scene today, so much of what the left is trying to do to erase large portions of our history and to fill in the blanks that they leave with mistruths, half-truths, and outright lies. I think it's important that we study our history, that we learn our history, because many of the answers to today's problems have already been dealt with if we just know how and where to look. So, you know, I think it's very important for all of us. So, having done that, you know, when you teach history, you read about a lot of these things. So much of what we learned in school, much of it is true, and again, some of it's partially true, and then some of it I'm not sure where it came from. But it's interesting to note, just out of curiosity, how many people, I'll treat you guys like I used to do with my students. I would throw things out and see who was on top of things. Abraham Lincoln spoke at the dedication of the National Cemetery at the battlefield at Gettysburg. And Gettysburg, as people know or learned in school, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, the largest land battle in North America, 52,000 casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg in July, the hottest part of July. You can imagine what it must have been like there. But the people of Gettysburg stepped up, wanted some type of an orderly and respectful burial for soldiers from all sides of that terrible conflict. And thus was created the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Now, Abraham Lincoln spoke there as President of the United States, and his speech lasted a little more than 2 minutes, as Bob demonstrated to us. And he didn't consider it a speech, he called it a few appropriate remarks. 2 minutes. Does anybody know who the keynote speaker was at the dedication ceremony for the National Cemetery at Gettysburg? Does anybody? Yeah, Jeff.
It was a Massachusetts, somebody in Congress from Massachusetts, I think. Elizabeth Warren?
No, she was fresh off the Trail of Tears. But you know what, Jeff? Jeff is perilously close. The person that was the keynote speaker at Gettysburg, who spoke for well over an hour, maybe 2, was a gentleman from Massachusetts who had been a congressman, had been a governor of Massachusetts, had been, he was Secretary of State under Fillmore, was a guy by the name of Edward Everett. You know, Edward Everett. So, but none of us remember that. He was the guy for speaking engagements back in that time. But what we remember are 2 minutes of a few appropriate remarks by one of the most remarkable individuals this country has ever produced, Abraham Lincoln. A brilliant man, and a man for his time. Think about when he was president, what was going on. He took the office of the presidency as the country was being torn apart, and then ran for re-election in the middle of that tumult and turmoil. He was opposed by his former commanding general, McClellan, ran for president. It was unbelievable, but he won re-election. There was a very strong peace movement in the country. They wanted to form a peace treaty where there would have been 2 countries. But Lincoln would not stand for that. He was a man of his principles. He spoke them loud, and he stood behind what he said. Such a rare quality, especially in today's day and age. We need another Abraham Lincoln. I pray to God we get him at some point in time real soon. But you think about that. Also, the 3, and I was talking to Bob earlier, the 3 most significant writings in American history, political writings, all came from the pen of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, that we all know. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1864. If you haven't read that, I encourage you to do that. And the third, which many people are aware of, but many are not, is something known as the Bixby letter. Have people heard of the Bixby letter? Where you may have been exposed, Google it if you get a chance. And I challenge you to read that letter without a tear in your eye. The Bixby letter was a letter that Lincoln wrote to a widow in the city of Boston who had lost a number of her sons in combat in the Civil War. And this letter was written by Abraham Lincoln and sent to her. And it's the most moving letter, I think, that you can ever read. So I encourage you, the Bixby letter. If people are curious about that, I'll remind you. But Abraham Lincoln was such an interesting person, and people may or may not realize, you know, we all know Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, right? Well, kind of. Kind of. Abraham Lincoln's lineage is very interesting. I first became acquainted with it. Now, I didn't learn it in school, but I did read about it in books later because I became interested in it. When I was fresh out of law school back in the early 1990s, and I was looking for a town in which to buy a house, one of the places that I was looking, I'm from the coastal area, I'm from Marshfield originally, but I was looking in Scituate and in Hingham and some of the towns around there. And one of the houses that I happened to look at was on an old mill pond on a road in Scituate called Mordecai Lincoln Road. Mordecai Lincoln, I wonder if he was related to Abraham Lincoln. Well, yes, he was. Well, does that mean that the Lincolns were from Massachusetts? Yes, they were. And the way that it goes, I had written some things down here. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He grew up in Indiana and lived his adult life in Illinois, but he had deep New England roots. Abraham Lincoln was descended from English colonists who settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 17th century. Lincoln's great-great-grandfather, Samuel Lincoln, who was a weaver by trade, sailed from Norwich, England to Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637, settling in Salem, but very shortly thereafter moving to the Plymouth County town of Hingham. In Hingham, Samuel Lincoln married a woman by the name of Martha Lewis. They had 10 children, which was common in those days. They had a lot of large families. They attended a church there that I have been in many times, and many people here may have as well. The old Ship Church in Hingham was where the Lincolns attended services. Samuel Lincoln's son, Mordecai, was born in 1657. He was a blacksmith. He was also a militia foot soldier in Hingham in 1679. And Mordecai owned a grist mill that still stands today as the Lincoln Mill Antique Shop. So if you're over in that neck of the woods and you want to get a little glimpse of history, that might be a good place to go. It was Mordecai Lincoln's son, who was also named Mordecai, who started the family migration out of New England. He moved his family to Monmouth County, New Jersey, and later to Pennsylvania. The generations of Lincolns thereafter continued migrations, moving to Virginia and then to Kentucky, which is where our president, Abraham Lincoln, was born, in Kentucky. Now, it's interesting to note, I used to, in years past when I had more time for such things, I did a lot of historical reenacting. I did French and Indian, American Revolution. I did the Civil War. I actually was a bodyguard for President Lincoln on many occasions. Pinkerton agent, the forerunner of the Secret Service. Good bunch of guys. But one of the things that I learned was, that those New England roots that he had ran very, very deeply. Now, it's interesting to note that while Lincoln was president, the genealogy stuff wasn't, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the DNA tests that could be done to tell you all these things. But it's interesting, I think Lincoln really was unaware of his New England roots until he was contacted in 1848. He was a congressman at the time, and a gentleman by the name of Solomon Lincoln from Hingham wrote a letter to inquire as to whether or not they were actually related, whether they were cousins. And although they thought that that was the case, they could not prove it conclusively because the records at the time were somewhat difficult to track down. Turns out they were cousins, the Lincolns from Hingham. But it's interesting to note that he also had other New England connections. Lincoln's father, Thomas, had two cousins in Boston, Amos and Jedediah, and those cousins were actually married to daughters of Paul Revere. They also served in the American Revolution in the Continental Army. So Lincoln was related to Paul Revere by marriage. Kind of an interesting twist. As fate would have it, Lincoln, he was not the only notable at that time that had connections to New England and Massachusetts. And one thing that I will note, Miles mentioned an East Bridgewater connection to Abraham Lincoln, and that connection does exist, and it's true. If anyone has ever been to the little post office in Elmwood and said, how is that little post office still in operation? Well, the reason that it's still in operation isn't because it's such an efficient post office, it's because it was opened and dedicated by Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if people were aware of that. But when I was doing the historical reenacting, one of the things, I came across a painting once, and this also sort of intrigued me. And it was a picture of a colonial gentleman who was chopping wood outside of a cabin. And behind him was one of the eastern woodland Native Americans running up behind him with a war club. And you could tell what was going to happen moments later in this picture. And the title of the picture was The Death of Abraham Lincoln. And that got me thinking, well, wait a minute. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater in 1865 by Booth. This guy's on the front, and it turns out that that was Lincoln's father or grandfather. Very, very interesting. So these things get you thinking. But other people, peripherally to the Lincoln story, that have connections to Massachusetts, we all know that Lincoln's assassin was John Wilkes Booth. And it's interesting to note that, John Wilkes Booth, we know him as an assassin, but if you lived in the time that he did in the 19th century, you would have known John Wilkes Booth for other reasons, not his politics. He was a very, very famous actor, which is why it was so shocking to people that not only had the president been assassinated, but he was assassinated by this famous actor. It was kind of a strange turn of events. But in 1863, John Wilkes Booth came to the city of Boston and purchased property upon which, in the south end, or the back bay, and on that land he intended to build a house after the war, but as you can imagine, he met his end before he was able to build that house. And it's the gentleman that brought about Booth's end who also has a connection to Massachusetts. His name was Boston Corbett. Now, Boston Corbett, geez, Boston, what are the chances? He was from Boston. Well, he wasn't from Boston, but he moved to Boston. He bought a house here in Boston and lived in Boston for a number of years. And his name was Thomas Corbett. But he had a religious epiphany while he was in Boston, and in honor of the city and to celebrate his religious epiphany, he changed his name to Boston. So Boston Corbett. So he wanted to honor the city that way. So it's interesting to note that, although there are many, many states that can claim part of the Lincoln legacy, I went, several years ago, I went to Springfield, Illinois, and you can imagine that is where Lincoln's law office is, and a lot of Lincoln-related things there. And I drove the tour guides absolutely crazy with a lot of my commentary, but it was all true. So the Lincoln family tree, I brought it if anyone's interested. Where does it begin here in the New World? It begins right here in Massachusetts, and in particular Plymouth County in 1637. So I thank the Massachusetts Bay Colony for having welcomed the Lincolns, and I thank the Lincolns for everything that they have done for us and this country. And on behalf of Mr. President Lincoln, we thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Sheriff. So, with that, the speaking portion of the event is complete. I would just like to remind folks that you don't have to leave. We can stick around for a little bit. The silent auction items are open. I'm going to keep them open for about another half hour. There are some great items up there, including a Trump bottle of wine that was graciously donated by Jeff Deal. There is an official Donald Trump merchandise from the Trump campaign, a Keep America Great hat, Keep America Great extra large sweatshirt, bumper sticker, and a rally sign. And also there is Manny Del Carmen, who, by the way, it's his birthday today, so everybody make sure you wish Manny a happy birthday. Manny is going to autograph an 8x10 picture, and you'll also get a $25 gift certificate here to Adria's if you win that silent auction item. So the silent auction is open. I'll announce the winners in about a half hour or so. With that, I would like, it's always, in the 21st century about pushing via social media and publicizing via social media. So all the elected officials that are in the room, along with all the members of the Republican Town Committee of East Bridgewater, in the next 5 minutes or so, if you could come up to the front of the room, we want to get a picture with Lincoln and all of the elected officials as well. So without any further ado, enjoy everybody's company. Check out the silent auction. Go support the New England for Trump store that's in the back of the room. And Manny Del Carmen is here to take pictures with his World Series rings. So thank you very much again for coming. And President Lincoln?
Hey, Miles, I'd like to say thanks to Ann Kerrigan for doing the cable job.
Yes, thank you. This will be broadcast on East Bridgewater Community Access Media. We thank Ann and all the crew at EBCAM for filming this and doing all the work that they do in the community as well. Also, as many of you know, the Republican Town Committee, we have a cable show here as well in East Bridgewater, and we will be filming it after the event today. I will be filming with Jeff Deal and Kathy Jo Boss, who are candidates for state committee here in the rest of East Bridgewater. It's made up by Senate District. East Bridgewater is split. So Jeff and Kathy Jo are running in precincts 1, 2, and 3. So if you're in any of those precincts, or Hanover, Halifax, Hanson, Plimpton, Whitman, Brockton, and the other portion of Easton, precincts 1 and 2 in Easton, make sure if you see Jeff's name and Kathy Jo's name on your ballot, you vote for them. If you're in the other portion of East Bridgewater or precincts 3 through 6 in Easton, you'll see my name under State Committee Man, so I'd appreciate the vote on March 3rd. But again, without any further ado, thank you all for coming.